говорите по-украински?
Well, I initially thought I would be able to speak Ukrainian, but I forgot many words and I find it easier to speak English.
I'm very grateful on the one hand for having the opportunity to talk in Sykhiv 10 years after my last visit. It's quite I'm still trying to recover from this state. And also for two reasons. One, because I think as an anthropologist it's always exciting and scary to come and talk to people who are actually from the place where you've been, and you try to do some work on a shorter period of time. On the other hand, because I think because it's a kind of an experiment, right? We are very much, at least in universities, we are very much secluded from the world, let's say, and our work has less impact than it should, probably. And it's constructed in a way in which people who contribute to it have very little chance to actually contribute meaningfully throughout the whole process. So in this sense it is a challenge to be back here. I have come to Ukraine and to Lviv in 2003 for the first time in my life, knowing only one person in Ukraine, whom I met a few months before coming here, and that was Father, now Bishop Butiak, whom I met by chance in another place. So, and I have come to Ukraine to study. This is one of the first questions that comes to mind. Why a Romanian scholar in Germany decides to study Ukraine, to come to Ukraine? It was because I had previously worked with and studied Greek Catholics in Romania, and I have been very interested to compare the two contexts. There are many historical similarities between the two churches, between actually several Greek Catholic churches in the region, but there are also big differences, and most of these differences come from the post-socialist, what we call the post-socialist in anthropology, or the post-Soviet period. So I was interested to look at these parallel trajectories of two different communities on the background of what people called the religious revival, right? In 1989 and the 1990s, religion became very loud and very present. So in this sense, it made a lot of sense for me to come to Lviv, which was at the time the center of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. They were still here and not in Kiev, like the church. But it was also the center, and Western Ukraine and Lviv was the center of a lot of religious enthusiasm and missionary activity expanding far into the post-Soviet region. And part of this broader project, which lasted, so I was in Ukraine for my PhD research about 15 months, a bit more than 15 months, between 2003 and 2004, and left 1 month before the Orange Revolution, which I have seen on TV and watched, talking to friends and being quite stressed about their fate. So I was interested in looking at the re-emergence of religion in public space, and the way it changed communities, it changed practices, it changed spaces, but also how religion has changed itself in the process. We have a sense that religion means something, but in fact religion means a lot what we, the state, churches, people define it, what it is. And there's been, and part of my work has been to look at what happened when what we call religion came out of this Soviet socialist period, which people, which had a particular type of secularism, right, of secular arrangement, into back into full view. Now, Lviv, let's see. Lviv has been one of the fastest developing industrial cities, right, in Soviet Ukraine, and this led to a quick growth of industry around and labor force, but with insufficient housing and infrastructure, basically, what people have called in this region under-urbanization. And this has been widespread in the socialist bloc, precisely because of this fast development, growth. Sykhiv is in this sense a good example, because of this entire industrial area around it, that surrounds it and developed over former villages, and yet relatively at the time, right, in the 1989-1990s, lowly urbanized space, and pictures that I'll show you from the 90s and early 2000s kind of reveal these empty spaces around it. Hence, it was, I think it deserved the term of Spalny Rayon, which people challenge these days, right, in saying that it has pejorative terms, but I think it kind of represented what it was. The residential area and the industrial zones were separated, but in fact the residential area was very much based on the rhythms and the institutions that made the district, so the factories around and the working schedules, the services they were offering, and maybe so in the sense, the life of people who moved the life of people who came to this district was very much shaped by the built environment, the way this district was designed, and by the industry around it, right? The place where they lived with these self-contained micro-districts, panel housing, the lack of infrastructure and institutions, which reflected not only what the ideology, Soviet ideology for building these things had in mind, which is progress, modernization, development, but also a very strong secular ethos. There was no place for religion in here, right? Now, from the 1990s, there was an opposite process of deindustrialization, yes, and closing of factories, warehouses, unemployment. But what is interesting is that even though the economic resources disappeared, right, so slowly, the urban growth continued, so urban development continued, and at some point it continued very fast. As if trying to catch up with this early phase in which industry was built very quickly around. So there was this interesting discrepancy. Now, as an example of this kind of late socialist project, Sykhiv it also emerges, and it has been presented as the representative other of the city, and the city center, the Lviv with its history. This is the contrast I try to capture with these pictures. Most of my pictures are from this period, 2003 to 2007. I have been in Sykhiv 2 days ago, trying desperately to update my understanding and image of the district, but it has shifted so fast that I couldn't find my way around. For example, to Starый Sykhiv, which is a place where I spent a lot of time, and I will talk about it. So it is indeed a district that is moving very fast. So there is this contrast with the rest of the city, especially the historical city and the heritage city. And contrast is even more pronounced these days, yes? Except for some alternative hipsters who would like to look into socialist urbanism, there are not too many people, tourists, who would come to Sykhiv for the moment. Now, and yet this image, right, of the socialist district and this image of a homogeneous space is in fact not as totalizing or as homogeneous as we can imagine. So if you walk around, especially when I came here with fresh eyes, walking around this space, it looked very much like not just one unfinished project, but many unfinished projects. Yes, there was a village or several villages that were destroyed, but not fully destroyed. So remains of these villages were still there, and you could see them. There was obviously a planned district that was unfinished as well, and you could see the ideas behind it, but at the same time you could see that it couldn't finish, which couldn't be completed, of course, because of the 1980s crisis. And there were many diverging visions already visible in the district, right? Every person who wanted to add something to his house, to have a small garden ahead, to have a small business somewhere. These were all competing visions, right? In a space that was open for interpretation. So I think that what is interesting, and I was listening, so this public lecture is part of a longer school, right, where people study more seriously maybe than me now, Sykhiv, and we'll know much more at the end. So in a sense, I've been thinking, listening to these presentations, that one of the fascinating things about the district is this unfinishedness, this constant metamorphosis, which makes it a very dynamic and resourceful district. There are always boundaries shifting, loosening up, disappearing and reappearing. And I think it makes it an interesting object even for the local, like to reflect on it, for local inhabitants as well as for scholars like me, and for planners or activists who are interested in that. And maybe the summer school is a good example. I mean, is an illustration of what I'm trying to say. Now, I would like to say that, so among the, there were many forces that changed this district, right? As I said, there were economic, there were political, social transformations happening. And I think you can trace all of them back, and there is no one cause that led to these changes. And people, right, they are one of the most important causes here between these big macro structural changes. But among the most powerful forces, I would argue, and this is basically the main argument of my presentation, was religion. And which I think became, for a moment, for a period, it became a central reordering principle of the whole district. And the story is interesting, but at the same time is not unique. This happened in many other socialist cities across the region. So religion empowered individuals to act, to appropriate, to change urban space. It overturned the accustomed journeys to factories, of the residents. It created new spaces of socialization. It mobilized people around alternative visions of the city, of community, of urban space. But it also generated new conflicts that broke communities and remade communities. And communities, I mean smaller social groups, if you want, right? And I have something to say about that too. So for this, I think we can consider religion as a major agent of urban change that brought new meanings, practices and spaces into these district places. And I wanted to show you, because we had a discussion yesterday about how Sykhiv appears as the alternative other, and to present Vova's Mirayon, which was a hit at the time I was here last. many years ago, right? But I passed that on because most of you must know it, and if not, you should. And move on. I mentioned briefly this is one of the planning, right? Of the 1970s planning of Sykhiv, and just to briefly remind you, is it visible? No, but you will translate. So the structure with the microrayon, this kind of self-contained, also small neighborhoods, and also the basic unit of urban planning. The center, which was supposed to embody the Soviet ideology, and the community center, headquarters, administration, and was never completed. Functional, right? The production, planning, work, home, so there was a connection between all these things. And the state control of housing, right? The distribution of flats, and the first block of flats was occupied by the army, right? I think in here. And built on the territory of 3 villages. So, I don't want to talk so much about the things that you know, the industry around, but so Sykhiv has its own kind of architecture, and the village and its surroundings, right, were turned into this modern satellite town. And most of the other buildings that were planned, hospitals, shops, kindergartens, schools, many of them were not built. Some of them were built later on. And the other thing is that many people here so the demographic was quite interesting because many people were coming from villages surrounding the city, right? And this was the first generation urban dwellers, which later changed with people, with Russians coming because of war, like specialists, with Chernobylcy in '86. And so the social tissue, the social fabric of the district changed a lot later on. And this raised a lot of issues about social inclusion. And I think these issues are even more important nowadays. But I don't know who addresses them. I could be very interested to know if someone knows can answer these questions. So I came to Sykhiv precisely because of this quick juxtaposition of 2 very different projects or visions of this district, right? A religious one coming and covering basically what was a Soviet planned space, and not just space, but the space that aimed to change people in a particular manner. Now, I want to start with we are in between, and this is kind of an interesting situation in between the Golgotha Church, the small Roman Catholic chapel somewhere behind, the Jehovah's Witnesses, which you can barely see from here, and the biggest, of course, church of the district. Again, a picture maybe from 2007, last time I was here, which is one of the best examples of what I was saying, an unfinished project. But constantly, unfinished is not the term because it presupposes that we know that it will end at some point. I think it's constantly transforming. It's like a project. And it's a project, interestingly, that also resonates very much with migration, because migrants always invest continuously in these projects that are objects of desire but are never fulfilled in the end. Yes, so there's an interesting parallel there. But this is the most emblematic, right, building, I think, post-socialist building in the district, which was supposed to basically came and set itself into an empty field, right, the first one. And what I want to do with you is to trace a bit the story of this and look at what happened and what kind of forces and how religion re-emerged in the public space. This is a picture taken for the some years ago. It's 2006, I think. for the time I was preparing the book. I wrote about my research in Ukraine, where you can still see empty fields, but I want to show you is this what was already here when I came, right? So you had Rizva Prezviatoi Bogorodice, you had the two chapels, and I'll show you these, the Orthodox Moscow Patriarchate and the Kiev Patriarchate. You had the Golgotha, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Roman Catholic Parish, many others, but only in this center, which was empty, completely empty before, there were already at least 6 groups, right, in the same place. And this is interesting because at the time, the strongest paradigm that tried to explain how religion reappeared in the post-socialist context was something called a marketplace of religions. So is that there was an empty space after the Soviet ideology collapsed, and this empty space was occupied by many different groups, new groups, old groups, all competing for the attention of people. And Sykhiv was a beautiful illustration of that, right? You had this empty space, completely empty, where in less than 10 years you had so many different groups within one square, all surrounded by blocks of flats, in which people, where you could feel that they are just looking outside and wondering, which church should I go to? Where should I go to today? Should I go on Saturdays to the Orthodox and on Sunday to the... How should I choose, right? So for a sociologist, this was heaven, basically. It was heaven, heaven on earth, sorry, to make it more concrete. And so this process was also interesting because it was not just a process from emptiness, I would translate emptiness with invisibility, or less visibility. Yes, religion was less visible, almost invisible if you want in this district. To public life, right? Religion completely becoming public, and so public you will see that it became annoying for some. And so this process from what people call the domestication or domesticated religion, right? Religion taken over by people and practiced more in the private sphere towards its return to the public. And the re-emergence of religion into the public space happened in a few Yes, we should welcome also Sykhivans, supposedly. So this process basically it happened by first of all by the reappropriation of spaces and buildings, which was both physical and symbolic. And it all started here in Old Sykhiv, the one I've been trying to find 3 days ago and couldn't find because of too many new blocks blocking the way, and moved from here to the center here. So before that, I'll just briefly mention, because I know there are some curious people in the room who are going to actually study this district. So this is the kind of methodology I used. This was another reason why I thought Sykhiv was super interesting, because I could wildly plan to use any kind of methods I wanted to, right? From archives, and I was lucky to find someone in the city archives who was a Sykhivian and who was passionate about getting all the documentation about Sykhiv. To participant observation, which meant starting on Sundays morning at 7 AM and finishing at 2 PM in Arsene, after going through all the 5-6 churches around. Systematic, so observing also different schedules and things. In-depth interviews, which I did with an interview guide with people from all these communities. Photo elicitation, I selected a set of photos and asked them to talk. Memory walks with people from, especially all the inhabitants of Stary Sykhiv, who had a very different memory of what was here and what has happened. Mental maps, many of you might know this, social networks, ego centers, a lot of religious activity because of the underground church, Greek Catholic Church, has developed non-institutional networks, right? So many people were connected through very different forms that were not necessarily visible. Now we do that with Facebook, right? Before it was a bit more complicated. Material culture, looking to the life of an artifact, of a flat, so the social life of a particular object or of a flat or of a building, and media analysis. So one word, this is not Sykhiv, this is from an album, a very nice album I found yesterday in one of the library in the center on the underground suffering of the Greek Catholic Church. But I think it's quite representative of people, the underground church people, doing in these blocks of flats where neighbors could hear you and everybody was suspicious on the other. People would go for blessing of houses, priests would go for blessing of houses, and they would also do a quick liturgy, a quick mass for the people there. So they would gather, do this and leave. And there is an interesting history to that. The Institute of Church History of the Greek Catholic Church has a lot of materials, but I have also interviewed a priest who lived here, who got a flat through this distribution housing. They didn't know what they did, actually. And who moved here with his brother, who was a Greek Catholic underground bishop, and created a whole monastic community in the district. The priest unfortunately died. I mean, not unfortunately, he was already old, but Father Naumescu. So there are in the old Sykhiv, there were these two in the village, the siege of there was a majority, like 70% Roman Catholic Poles, and maybe about 30% of Greek Catholic Ukrainians. Ukrainians were a proper tsekva, and the Roman Catholics across the street had a proper koshchok, yes. Which was named the Blessed Mary Queen of Poland, and when Greek Catholics took it over in 41, they changed the name to, no, earlier, to St. Michael's, right? St. Michael's, the Archangel Church. And the Church of the Blessed Trinity, which was closed in 1953 and declared an architectural monument, yes. There are many stories around it, including the fact that Khmelnytsky's daughter was married in the church, just to give it more substance. But the point is that, and this is how many, as probably you know, how many churches survived by becoming museums, right? And this was a way also to be able to sustain them, yes, to change the roof if it was necessary, and all kinds of things. Now in the 1980s, when the whole urban planning was taking place, was undertaken, some people suggested that the church should be moved to a museum, and then the local intellectuals, I don't know exactly who, but they say local intellectuals, protested, and because of the value, the architectural value of the building, so they decided to keep it here. And in a sense, this helped the cemetery and the church help this remain like a bubble, but on the margins, on the periphery of the district. Yes. So and you've seen this in this picture, right? So almost on the boundary between the factories. In fact, if you walk through, you pass some of the old factories, and the new center. And what should I say more about this? Is that the church was a functioning church. So this is a picture from 1932 with a teacher and children there, and we have documentation about it also because there was a massive restoration of the church done by a Greek Catholic priest. who everybody complained about because they spoiled the church. But also very apparently pedagogical society and a theater society in here. And maybe before I get to that, there was also, and this is this will come back, yes, Father Otec Dr. Andrei Ischak, this Pan Kachik, who was the former administrator of the church, died. I just heard, I met the priest 2 days ago, and heard he died some years ago. But so Father Ischak, who was the Greek Catholic priest, was killed in '41 by the Soviets, and he's buried in the cemetery, and was sanctified, canonized by the Pope when he came here in 2001, together with 27 other martyrs of the church. So this was an extra recognition of this place. Now, maybe the thing to say about, one more thing to say about this church is that this museum, the keys from these museums were at Lviv Art Gallery, right? So one member of the local council at the time, who was also a Greek Catholic practicant, went there, took the keys, came, opened the church, and people started to have a service there. But they started to have a service there also because this underground priest was living in Sykhiv, and everybody knew him, so he simply went there and started to perform liturgical services. And he was also known as an exorcist, so that helped publicity added to it. The other church, this was built in 1910, funded by the parishioners, and it's representative of the shifts taking place here, because after World War II, so it was Polish, but after the war it was taken over by the Ukrainian Greek Catholics, and then in '46 it became Orthodox because the Greek Catholic Church was how do you call it, made illegal, decreed illegal, and priests were asked to sign. And the priest was here actually signed, but said that he remained in his soul Greek Catholic. And it was used until 1990, when it was taken over by the Greek Catholic Church, and it's still a Greek Catholic Church. It's simply just across the street, for those of you who do not know it. Now, but the other interesting thing is that the people who came, there were a lot of the Ukrainians who were here during the socialist times were actually the pereseljanci from Poland, right? So these were people who came here from Poland rather than local inhabitants. Now, what happened is that after they opened the old church, the Greek Catholic priests who were active here already and very active had their eyes on the bigger church, and the community was also putting a lot of pressure at the time, the parish community here, on the two priests who were there to make it, to turn to Greek Catholicism. But it was not the priest didn't really want to, the two priests who were there, the older one, Father Turka and Father Kuzio. So they decided to stay Orthodox, and that was pretty tricky. So I have stories from other places where I have worked, where the community, to convince the priest, locked him in the church and didn't let him out until he agreed with the community. So it was not a very easy thing. But here parishioners were split. So what happened was, in the end, the same person from the local administration decided to do a referendum. And they did a referendum in the club next to the nearby factory. And at the referendum, where they allowed only people who lived in this area, right, they decided that the church should become Greek Catholic. However, they could not convince the priest to give the keys. So there was a whole, somewhere in between legal and illegal, taken over at some point of the church by the Greek Catholics, and the two priests who were there had to move somewhere else. So now from here, what I've been talking about in this part is basically the reappropriation of spaces, yes, and recycling from museum to church, from Orthodox Church to Greek Catholic Church, and all these things. Now, moving to this transition to the square, what happened is that Father Koronovsky had this idea that they should go immediately and occupy the central square, which was empty. So on Easter Tuesday, on 17th of April, right, 1990, this is taken from the archive of the church that is here, and the pictures there are many pictures online also if you are interested to look. There was a big procession that left the old Sykhiv and came all the way to the new Sykhiv and put a cross. And a tall wooden cross in the memory of the Ukrainian martyrs, and celebrated the first public liturgy in the center of the district. Afterwards, they continued to perform services every day. They didn't move away, just to make sure that nobody comes, takes the cross, claims the land or anything. So they continued to perform services every day until they got the right to the land. And remember, at the time, I mean, there was a strong connection, so many Greek Catholics, including some dissidents, were very much part of Narodny Ruch, and were very much part of the movement, the political movement, right, that was starting. So they actually, the Greek Catholics had a lot of support, yes, institutional support. So by September 1991, they got this. On April 17, they blessed the groundstone. They got the hangar, and they placed the hangar right on next to the spot where the church is now. And if you walk out of this beautiful center, you will see that the hangar is currently dismantled to make space to a church, to a school that is going to be built. So I don't want to go through the details of that, but simply to show how this transition from old Sykhiv, from the periphery to the center, happened very consciously, emerging basically from these underground priests in connection with practicing Greek Catholics, who simply took the initiative and went and took over the space, like the pioneers. And only afterwards have claimed the legal rights for it. At the same, so this is in the hangar, for those of you who want to have a memory of how it looked like, where people used to serve, and which I have also where I have also attended. There were more like meetings and Sunday schools at the time. So here you have a very good contrast, right, between the empty square. This is the picture again from the archives from the blessing of the grounding stone of the church, and this is the church, a picture I took in 2007. You see, there's still space, but not anymore. From the foundation stone, and something that happened very quickly. And at the same time, the two priests who, if you remember, we left them without a church. They didn't have the church anymore, but they had the parish house. 10 minutes. They have also moved to the center. So they did this transition just opposite, almost opposite, a bit in diagonal. So they are here, right? They put this little chapel, and they started to serve there. And this chapel was there, is still there today, even if it looks much better than what it was. And with that chapel with that chapel there, they started to build a church. So these were the two. These are again pictures from 2006, I think. So slowly they started to build on this land. The priest, if you ever go, the old priest who was serving here has also died. There's a young priest now. But if you go close to the altar, I think there used to be a maquette, how do you call it?
Model?
A model, thank you. A model of the church he wanted to build. And that church that he wanted to build was almost as big as the Rispan across the street. And this was his dream. So what you have now is another thing, is actual competition, and also not just relocation and occupying of space, but actual competition. And with the further splits within Orthodoxy, as you know, there was Autocephalous Orthodox Church, later on Kiev Patriarchate, Moscow Patriarchate. The two priests didn't get along, so to cut the long story short, this is now and still is the Kiev Patriarchate Church, St. Volodymyr, and the other one is the Moscow Patriarchate Church. Let me see where I am, because I have later time. So this all competition happening in the old Starry Sykhiv has moved to the new one. And the split, this territory remains disputed until this day, right? So if you go and walk there, you can see that each priest marked his own construction materials with a different cross, and the things are in place exactly as they were more than 10 years ago, which kind of gratifies me, because when I came with these stories to my supervisor in Germany, he looked at it and he said, "Oh, this is just post-socialist transition. It will all go away, you know, when things get settled." And in fact, it got settled and nothing went away, which is kind of surprising, right? So let me say something. There is a paradox here between fragmentation, what I've been talking about. You have this idea of a district with people live together, they know each other, they don't know each other, but they kind of their only reference point is that they live in Sykhiv, which is a Soviet district, kind of at the periphery, where you have to go to the center to reach to, I don't know, many services that are not available there. And all of a sudden you have all these communities competing. So this leads to a fragmentation where people even within one family split. Yes, they say, "Oh, I go there, you go there. Oh, I think, you know, we should be patriots and go to the Kiev Patriarchate." Yes, but the Autocephalous Church is more patriotic than and this kind of discussions. So, and some actually follow. So you have fragmentation. On the other hand, so what we imagined as a homogeneous community, basically, both because that's how the environment was built and because of the original, of the fact that they all came together into this place, has changed significantly. On the other hand, you have strong mobilization. So you have these two processes in parallel, fragmentation and mobilization. And they are very closely tied to each other. So both Ristva, the church, again from the archives, and the Orthodox small church next door were all built, and Golgotha here, and other churches were all built through voluntary work. So the priest went to factories around and asked directors, "Can I get some materials for the church?" They made plans and asked people, invited people, you know, asked people, so who is a good builder? Who is a good engineer? Who can come and dig holes for us? And people contributed a lot. So it has been, people devoted a lot of time to this work. Construction laborers, technical specialists, engineers, participating not just in religious activities, but in the whole construction work. And this is ironic, because the people who built this district, the architects, the planners who built this district, also had this idea that somehow people move in, you know, people should contribute to it, so the community should contribute to it. Is also the way they imagine the construction of the district. It's also the architect who made the plans for the Ristva, the church, had this in his mind when he designed the church, that people actually, that it should be based on volunteer work. And if I was listening today to activists in this district who say the same thing, that we should involve the people, the community, they should all come together, and this should be our, you know, working for themselves and being there for themselves. So you see a very nice thread all throughout this time and persisting, even though people are actually, you know, they appeal to it in the name of very different ideologies, if you know, yeah? Just to put it bluntly. So the fact that it was a working class district helped a lot because of labor, because of materials, because of all these things. So these could be built for this reason. Briefly, I have to finish. I was surprised 2 days ago to see that the church I have seen being started is now Zeslania Sviatovo Duha, is now finished after 15 years. This church has been built when there were already enough churches in this district, I think. But people, what is interesting is at the time, so again a hangar, a plan for a big church, people serving in the hangar, the church is already, everybody from the streets around had a plan when they should come and work at the church. Right? So this is it continues in this manner. And it says something about the fact that every, you know, the way Soviet planners imagined this as having all these self-contained micro districts, if you want to call them, right, where there is the kindergarten or a school, something in the middle, and this, it worked very well for the churches because each micro district wanted to have its own church. This is the latest, which I've seen again 2 days ago. It was not there, it's at the very edge when the factory starts. It is Ukrainian autocephalous church because one was missing from here. It's very far away. There is one that is close to Shuvar, so that's quite far from the center of action. Let me try to close. So, in this sense, mobilization really meant grassroots mobilization for this project. And it was on a massive scale for Ristva, which was the biggest, the church next to us, which was the biggest construction project at the time. But it was there present for all these smaller projects. Golgotha was built in a similar way, if you go and talk to them. I don't introduce the Jehovah's Witnesses here. Now, following this idea of one church for each micro commune, for each micro district or each community, we can observe two other processes. A second process of spatial fragmentation and the reorganization of the district. This is when you have one district with one church, Ristva and Sykhiv, identifying, the Pope helped, many things helped, but it's there. And then when you look down into it, you see that each community wants to have its own church, yes? And this also was a deal with the priests. So when I went blessing houses with the priests from Ristva, they would say, oh, we stop here because that's the other priest who will come. In fact, when doing a survey in Sykhiv, the actual accurate data was with Ristva and not with the local administration of who was what and who lived where and families and all these things. They had a very clear view of the district and the people here, and it's their activity and pastoral work and everything that they've done in the district is absolutely impressive. It's a pity they are not here. The second, yes, so in a sense, these things that happened, the religious multiplication and fragmentation followed the logic of socialist plans, right? On the other hand, you had confessional pluralization, fragmentation. So each other group came. This was supposed to be one of the buildings of the administration, but it was taken over by Jehovah's Witnesses, who have their kingdom hall, right? How is it called? Here. Tsarskie something. Yes.
Zal Tsarstva.
Zal Tsarstva. Yeah. Now, Golgota, they first rented a place in Kino, Dovzhenko at the time, and from there moved here and built construction. The Roman Catholics in a former pioneer camp behind. The story of the Roman Catholics, like the story of Moscow Patriarchate, shows how powerful the Greek Catholics are. The Moscow Patriarchate chapel, they could never register the church until the Pope came, and then the Greek Catholic hierarchy intervened with the local administration and said, well, now let's be all brothers and let them have their space there. So up to 2001, basically, they couldn't. Is it 2001 when the Pope came?
Yeah.
So I'm not a historian, as you see. And there are many other examples. The Roman Catholics the same. So Polish Roman Catholic Church has recovered less than 10% of their churches in the whole Western Ukraine. And rather than going back to Saint Michael, which was built by parishioners' money, and in 1910, Roman Catholics, they simply prefer to move here, close it, and many other places. So I think that basically the impact these churches, all of these groups and religious groups had on Sykhiv extends beyond the actual reconfiguration of urban space, right? And I don't know how much I could prove this to you, but through the making of new communities, social mobilization, sustained pastoral work, they reshape the social fabric of the district in very important ways. And there are many examples from that I could give you. But one of them is, let's say, the Pope's visit, which mobilized, when they mobilized thousands of volunteers from the district, but also people who came, people who lived here brought their families, friends over, in different of religious, ethnic or political allegiance. So there were people of all confessions or religions who came just because it was a big event. And interestingly, I think this is quite characteristic of Sykhiv, that despite the fragmentation and the conflicts that I mentioned until now, there is a kind of a common religious ground to sustain and build on in the future. And this is explained by weak confessional affiliation, so this is part of which has been an important factor in the... So there are weak affiliation, people are not so committed to institutions themselves. And high levels of religiosity that were already there, so a kind of traditional devotional practice that is more rural rather than urban, right? So in this sense, very much centered on big feasts, on family events, on family-related events, which goes beyond confessional boundaries or institutional affiliations. And this reminds of this particular social demographic composition of the district itself and the place where we are, like right in Halichina, with villagers turned urban dwellers. Now, in fact, most people we interviewed in a 2004 survey we did not really consider that they even change a confession. For Orthodox, Catholic, 3 types of Orthodox, despite all these major shifts that I have described. And even newcomers who came to the district, like the Roman Catholic Polish priest who came from Poland, or the Golgota American pastor who came here, they had to adapt or leave to the local practices. Because it was a very strong kind of, there were very strong expectations of what should be practiced in these communities from the people. And since they had a very important part, they took an important, they took an important part in this, in this whole work. They had their claims on that. So to finish, during these almost 20 years that we've seen, Sykhiv has been reimagined and transformed in major ways, turning from a sleeping district into a very dynamic and resourceful neighborhood, as I said, moving from the periphery of the socialist district to the very center, the empty center, in a symbolic but also very practical, political, economic and social, way, Religion re-emerged in the 1990s in this secular space created for a very different purpose, and it demanded full recognition. Now, within just a few years, it reshaped completely the whole district, and also this secular modernist character, and the contrast between the blocks and the icons that I started with is telling of this transformation. It recycled Soviet spaces, symbols, created new spaces, new symbols, proposed new visions of the district and also of community and community life, and became a major marker of identity. I think that the last 10, 13 years since I've done this research has brought many changes, and which I don't know about, and I'm happy to hear about, rather asking you questions than hearing your questions. Because there's been very radical but also incremental changes. Migration, massive migration, neoliberalization, Maidan and its aftermath, the war in Donbass, incoming IDPs. And this, of course, led to big transformations, I think, that are, maybe some of them are not really visible, and they will be visible. This has also led to new modes of imagining the city, new modes of urban mobilization, including these new forms of activism, right to the city type that you see everywhere these days, that are already manifested in the district. And I want to thank Natalia for sending me this picture. While many of these testify to a newly recovered secular sensibility, so the fact that we imagine that religion should be separated from certain things nowadays, is kind of justified, let's say. I think that we should still recognize religion as an important resource for the local community and envision ways to recruit it in our social and urban projects. Thank you.
Next, we will be able to discuss this. We could ask questions to the lecturer, and before that, I would like to ask you whether we should be putting the air conditioner on. And if you want to ask the question or raise your comment, you have to raise your hand. So the first person raising the hand will be honored to get a microphone and ask the question.
Добре, питаю по-українськи. Слухаю, що.
I will ask it in Ukrainian. Well, thank you so much for the great lecture. As far as I know, this is the only survey about Sykhiv, about the religious space of Sykhiv, which was done 10 years ago. As far as I know, well, I tried to Google about this, but I failed to find any other things on that. So my question is, how do you personally explain, despite the fact that we have the increasing number of different churches, we see the growth of the monuments of the Holy Virgin almost everywhere, even in the hallways, in the residential buildings and next to the houses. I don't have the answer to this question. Honestly, I am not ironical about it. I really try to understand what is the process all about. What do you think about it? Maybe we could ask this to Sykhiv residents.
So if there's any person from Sykhiv who wants to answer before me, whether they have an idea why this. So the question was basically, do you want us to say it in English also?
For Sykhiv?
Or, yeah, because...
Dear English speakers who don't understand Ukrainian, please, hands up. 1, 2.
Don't worry, no worries. So apart from this kind of building of churches and all this, what Svetlana was saying is what you see nowadays is how do you call them? Statues of the Mother of God. Godmother is another. Of the Mother of God in appearing everywhere. And the question was why? Like, it's a puzzle that she has. And I would really turn these questions to people who live here and who maybe they have something to say about it. I have answered. Yeah. Super. Yeah.
Marta Gul, я архітектор із
Marta Gul, I am the architect by education, by background. Maybe I will be able to partially answer this question. Well, the Holy Virgin, well, it is typically perceived by Ukrainian people as the protector, the Mother of God. They mostly have them at the school buildings, and also many residents would rather opt for the statue of the Mother of God rather than some small kiosks or shopping centers. And maybe this is the culture of the Ukrainian people, not the Jesus Christ but the Blessed Mary. But not all denominations are in favor of that, like the Jehovah's Witnesses are not have a very special attitude to the Blessed Mary. That's why they are not in favor of that. But these issues pop up sometimes in different media. And if you want to know more about the history of Sykhiv churches, I could give you the answers. I guess I am the daughter of this person from the local administrator. My father was arranging this referendum, and he did a lot for the Sykhiv church, the small wooden church, and the rendition. Thank you. Thank you for your comment. My name is Alexandra Mesel. I'm a lawyer, and I have a different opinion on why we have these mass installations of the statues of the Mother of God. As you know, since the late 2013, we have the war in the east, basically the war. In my opinion, both in Galicia and all over Ukraine, this religiosity is enhancing, and people need more worshipping for the Blessed Mary. They believe she is the one to protect the nation. We know the history of Ukraine, and in different periods of time people were addressing the Holy Virgin as the only force able to protect them from the foreign aggression. I think this is connected to the religiosity and its enhancement. I think that the growth of the statues of the Blessed Mary can be explained that in Sykhiv we have many religious communities that practice the cult of worshipping the visual objects and the Blessed Mary as such. We know that God is eternal. He was not born, he was not created, but according to the Bible, he took his body from Mary, but not his holiness. But there is this cult, and some people believe that Mary could be helping, but there is one God, one mediator between men and our Father the God, and they say that please, dear children, do not go in sin, but if you have, we have only Jesus the God who could protect us. Not. I think the fact of this big number of the statues of the Mother of God is connected to the fact that we have a big number of such illustrations in the central part of the city, in the inner city, and there are many of them, and they are located in different sites in this old architectural part of the city. And maybe the Lvivians have the habit that this sculpture is something very common for the city. And in such a new space where there is this habit, but there is no this object, they find a need to fill this emptiness, this void with these statues, in my opinion. I think that many people believe, the believers, that the religious object does have an impact on the space, on the environment, and next to this image you cannot like drink vodka around or do some bad things. And this way they believe it enhances security of this space. I think this is also one of the reasons for the other people to install the statues of the Blessed Mary. We had a meeting with all these Mohammeds that the samples, this should not be the city center, but the neighboring country, they have this cult of Mary, and maybe people go there, and you can see very many sculptures like this in the cities and towns all around in Poland. And Oles also claimed that before the war it was quite widespread, also in the villages. Also in these villages, in Pasiki, etc., there were very many Roman Catholics all around. We could be talking about continuity, but also about the transborder issues. This is the result of our meeting discussion. Could I continue? Could we be talking about the double identity of the Sykhivians, like a post-Soviet identity, which is not very religious, and this religiousness works like the God will be only for big holidays. We only go to church on Sundays, and the Blessed Mary would be symbolizing our Christianity. It's all around in this yard. So what do you want from me? We have this religiosity represented with the sculpture.
I'm just thinking how to get out of this. I think everyone's right, because there is no one answer. But I think, I mean, the most interesting thing for me in what Svetlana was asking is why now and why here. And we already have, so there are people who give a cultural reason for that, saying, well, it's because we are used to this, it's because it's part of our environment. Give a believer's response to that and say it is important for our faith, and it is important precisely now when we are really challenged. There are challenging times, and it helps us. And there are other responses to that, of course. But I think what is interesting in precisely this image is the way it is put as a statement. The way the statue is a statement that we are in this way rather than other ways, and that this is a statement on urban space that people have made in the district. Some people made. So I don't know who put the statue here. You know more about that. But my first question as an anthropologist would be, who puts those statues, right? Deputat? No. So who? The question. I mean, it is a claim to the city, and it is a legitimate claim to the city. It is a claim that you could not make in other places, in other countries where the public space is so secularized that people would not accept it. I remember a colleague of mine, and this just because anthropologists love to make wild comparisons, a colleague of mine wrote an entire beautiful article of a fight between that emerged in Brighton, I think, in a mall where the Bible Society wanted to put some figures for Christmas that looked like angels, and people refused. They said, no, they are angels. This is a space which is a secular space, and you are not supposed to do that in this space. So there are, I think, religious sensibilities, and this is kind of the message at the end also of my presentation, are extremely important here in this particular district. Religion is very important for people, and these statues are not just statues, and we should take them as such. And we will see more and more challenges in the years to come, right? Because that's how it goes. So we will see other challenges to the space, but this is a clear contestation of public space. And I think, just to come back to my argument, I think that religion was the major reordering principle in the late 90s, like in the 90s up to early 2000, precisely because there was no other equal force at the time. And they had full support. So legislation was not there in place, economy was not going well, there were, and people, you know, it was very important for people, so they could go on and do that and achieve what they achieved.
Ještě dotázné komentáři.
Thanks so much for this lecture. It was really very stimulating, I think, especially for our students. And I would like to continue. I found it especially interesting how you showed this continuity from like Soviet micro-district to this post-Soviet situation when churches filled the gaps very well. My question is about the relation of churches to other newly constructed buildings, namely buildings with consumerist function. So this great and nice shopping malls. And actually, did you try to trace how actually the flow of people is organized and what are the patterns of behavior of people on Sundays when they exit the church? So they had a super choice to go either to Arsene or to another shopping mall on the other hand, or on the third side of the building. So how everything works actually, and how, for example, priests in the churches see their neighbors with a consumerist attractiveness. Do they see them as a kind of competition as well, or maybe on the contrary, those who built the shopping malls, they also see this place near the church as most attractive and favorable also for them to compete for the attention of parishioners who exit the church. Or actually, maybe we have here not a competition between consumerism and religion, but some other type of relations or cooperation.
A part of the story I didn't tell you is that when Golgota when the community here wanted to build a church, they wanted a place next to Rizba. And the priests said that it's not a good idea. So the local administration at the time gave them the place behind, where they are now. Years after, Arsene took that place. So basically, exactly, it's about temporalities of development, I think. So economic development came a bit later in here. And as such, and I think you can trace this exactly in this way. So there are different, these processes have different temporalities. And it was much later that economic force could make an imprint into the district. And I was surprised, so, you know, when was Arsene built? Do you remember? Does anybody know? People with local people? 2000, yeah, so it was built, really? Yeah. Okay. So, yes, so it was the first mall here, right? And people were doing like I was doing, as I said in the beginning. So, you know, you would go to church. They were only going to one church, fortunately. And then end up going in Arsene, you know, you're shopping and things. It's also the novelty of a place, but it's the proximity, right, that is here and consumerism. The relationship between religion and consumerism, I think, I mean, I'm always afraid to answer this question in a simple manner, because most of the people have an ethical, moral expectation that religion should not have any economic dimension, and that's absolutely not true. I mean, this is an ideal kind of maybe part of our modernizing history, right? That religion should be separated. So, in fact, it's very much part and parcel of everyday life, and economy is a part of it in the same way. It's a nice way to escape your question. But exactly because I also don't know much about it, so I don't know the relationship between these churches and the mosques, you know, whether and also people. I would have loved to see the demographic changes in this district, but besides the 2001 data and the small, so I did a survey here with the students from the sociology department in 2004. We took 300 and something interviews, actually questionnaires here, and I have some data from there. It's not so much economy related, but I don't have an idea about the patterns. If anybody knows, I would be happy to. I'm curious about it.
Maybe I. Yes.
I don't know. Ukrainian or
When I was maybe Ukraine,
when I was in church, the priest is calling not to go to Silpo or Arsen because Sunday is the day for having rest, and this way we make the employees of Arsen and Silpo work, and it's a big sin to work on Sunday. And if we trace the situation of the public garden at the Nativity Church, they didn't even pave the path to this Arsen, and people still actually walk there, and it's very dangerous because when it's raining, you can it gets slippery and it can fall down. So there is this issue.
So it's a slippery road again. Our Prime Minister, Orban, he's not my Prime Minister, I don't vote, I'm not Hungarian, but I live in Hungary, right? So our crazy Prime Minister, Orban, decided that suddenly that all shops should be closed on Sunday precisely because of this reason. It has nothing to do with religion. It's political, it's political capital, right, what he was trying. And when he realized that in fact it decreases his popularity, he changed it the next day. So I don't think that. Of course, the church has, and the Greek Catholic Church. You're talking about the Greek Catholic Church, right? Yes. The Greek Catholic Church, on the one hand, has a huge moral capital because of the underground suffering. On the other hand, it has to deal now with a completely different environment where corruption, business and everything has to go. So how people like priests and people in this church manage between these things is a very delicate thing, right? It's not it's not something that that is black or white. Because the situation changed, and in my work, I have looked at precisely one of the interesting things for me was how people can adapt. So those people who were Greek Catholics in the underground and who went through very difficult moments through that, suddenly being able to do whatever they want. Freedom is scary, right? It's scary, it's dangerous, it's powerful at the same time. So people have changed a lot, and part of that is not a good change. Part of that has been a good change for society, right? The fact that they came out in the public with such huge moral capital.
Vlad, дуже дякую за лекцію.
Thank you for your lecture. We traditionally know that the public spaces for Ukrainian villages would be the schools and churches. So, in this respect, I have a question. Is Sykhiv a city at all? Is it part of the city? And even this example with the square of Revolution of Dignity, it was the result of the compromise with this statue of the Blessed Mary. So this is the first question. And the second question, when I was taking the tram, this is my first time in Sykhiv, and I heard the speech of the announcer about the tram stops, and it looked very similar to Kyiv subway. And I think this is the tram into the city. For Sykhiv, this is the tram into the city, cityward tram. So my question is, could we actually claim that Sykhiv is a city?
Can I give the word to Sykhivians, to people from Sykhiv to answer this question? I remember talking to people many years ago, right? More than 10 years ago, 13 years ago, who had these fantasies that they could become a separate city. But that's not realistic, I suppose. What was the question about the school and the church? Again, because you started with that.
I said that school and the church is traditional public spaces for Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian religions.
Okay. It was a statement, kind of.
Yeah. Theory. It's my theory.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you look at Zislania Svetovo Duha, in fact, what you have here, this is a school, right? People who live here can say. And the church.
Kindergarten.
It's a kindergarten? I don't remember. The kindergarten and the church.
But
in школа. І тут, де Київський патріархат.
Але школа там далі ще є.
Друзі, давайте не говорити без мікрофона, бо перекладачка вас не дочуває. Вибачте.
Вибачте. So they are very much together in here, but you know the schools have been here as part of the initial project, right? And people wanted to have. I like one of the reasons. The other reasons I like Sykhiv is that it surprises you. It offers, you know, you walk somewhere and there's suddenly a new Mother of God coming out. So I think spaces generally. I'm not an urban specialist. Yes, I'm working on religion, but I think spaces afford certain things, right? It's kind of it invites you to put something there, and then you just go and put it if you can and see what happens if it's possible. Yeah? Yes.
I actually wanted to say that when they are saying that usually it focuses around the school or the church in Sykhiv. Well, I know that 20 years ago I was staying on my maternity leave with my kids. On the weekend, 2/3 of Sykhiv, or most of the Sykhiv residents, were leaving for the weekend to their villages, to their home villages. But today it's very different because there are young generations who are detached from villages. But from the young generations, the school is the center. Like the premises of the school, this is the place where the school children used to stay around. My relatives, they moved to Wrocław. For them, the church was everything, and all children were going to church next to the premises of the church, not to the school. They had some fun. There was the community meeting places. The church is not the place like this. In Sykhiv, for the young generations, this is the school, the meeting place, the socializing place. You have a comment or a question? Then let's take turns. Thank you for this lecture. My question is, well, in the beginning you used to say that this process of revival of religion in a socialist districts is not unique for Lviv. It is typical for many other socialist cities. Maybe you could tell us more about that. Could you expand on that? Are they taking the same pattern, the same scenario, or are there any peculiarities? So this is the first question. The second question is that religion has been transforming throughout this process. I realize it's not possible to give the full answer to this question, but maybe you could comment on that. Thank you.
Should I answer? Yes. Okay. In short, yes, it was very different in different places. So if you just across the street, let's say in Przemysl, it's not really across the street, but almost. People were fighting for churches because there, the Roman Catholic Church also, and Romania is another example like that. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to compare Greek Catholics in Romania and Ukraine, because you have majority churches. So these are 90% of Romanians are Orthodox, more than 90 nominally, right? The same in Poland. These became homogeneous countries. So in this sense, it's been very hard for religious groups to proliferate, different ones. It's been a struggle. So this is what, and of course the religion itself has played very different roles during socialism. So one of the problems with the Greek Catholic Church in Romania was that it was small, regional. This is no different from here that much. But it was facing a huge institution that was fully connected to, during socialism also, with the power. So they couldn't get back one single church, only with fights, and after years and years, legally, it took many years to do that. It's been very hard for them. And in Ukraine, first of all, you were riding, so you know the churches were riding on a wave of patriotism, let's call it, because nationalism has more negative connotation, even though in those times it was something very important for people, especially in Western Ukraine. So it was really part and parcel of this whole process of transformation, yes, and mobilization. But there was so much fragmentation between all these four different Greek Catholics, Orthodox, Kievsky Orthodox, Moskovsky Orthodox, Autocephalous, and none of the Ukrainian presidents wanted to get involved into that. So if the whole history of you know, of the independence until recently, at least, is they never wanted to recognize one church as national. They never wanted to give more privileges visibly to one church, because it would have spoiled the balance. So it was not a marketplace of religion, but it was, I think, a fortunate balance of forces which allowed this to happen. And people were very interested in religion. So I remember in the village, I also worked in a village not far from Lviv. In the village, all people were reading the Jehovah's Witnesses magazines, saying, look how interesting things they say. We don't agree with them because they don't bury the dead. But this is very interesting what they say about religion, you know, and we have very good discussions when they come they come to preach, but we have excellent discussions about religion, you know, together, and about life and cosmos and whatever. So people were very interested in that, and they would speak about, even if I would have come to Ukraine to look at, I don't know, factories, I would have ended up talking about religion. There was no other way around, I think, at the time. Yeah, this is the first. The second, I wrote a book about this, the transformation of religion from... So one thing that we have to understand is that, you know, Soviet ideology was not atheist in the sense in which it tried to completely destroy religion. But or if it tried in the beginning, at least ideologically, it realized there's no way to do it, so it transformed it. How do you say, it took it over, kind of, right, and made something else out of it. And this is most visible in Central Asia, for example. So in places where there was no big religious institution, it was created, and now it's like official Islam has nothing to do with Islam, in a sense, right? But it's under the control of the state. And incorporated religion in this sense. In other places like Romania, it became part of national folklore. So most of what you called religion could be played on stage by pioneers without any problems, because it was part of our heritage. So it was heriticized, which is what happens today, ironically, with the center of the city. I mean, if you go into a church, is it a church or is it a touristic a museum? Yeah, it's a similar process of secularizing religious buildings. What is most important, I think, is that people here, especially in Western Ukraine, practiced, maintained, and tried to practice a kind of a religious tradition that remained very much traditional. I would hate that word, but it remained like that. And in a sense, this even reached the Russian Orthodox Church, because many people who were coming priests, there were also these generations of priests. So the father was a priest, the son is a priest. Since it's missionary, you know, the seminaries were in Leningrad or Moscow or somewhere, they would go there and they would become priests of the Russian Orthodox Church, but they would keep the religious tradition as they had it from family, most of them. And in this sense, it was easy for priests who did this whole trajectory, came back to Western Ukraine, to just switch back to Greek Catholicism or national orthodoxy afterwards. This explains partially the easiness, if you want, with which a Ukrainian national church could be formed, if not so many egos and interests.
Скажіть, будь ласка, чи ви досліджували
Could you please tell us, did you study in terms of religiosity of the Sykhiv neighborhood? Did you study the conflict of legalization of installing the visual objects for worshipping in the communities and churches who are practicing the different worshipping practices of other denominations? And also, did you study the legalized dismantling of such visual objects like you had in the previous image? Because there is this opinion that people might believe in God because of God's will and on the basis of the God's word. What do you think about this?
Світлано, чи можете ви повторити переклад у мікрофон? Я от
I don't want to get you wrong on that. No,
So the question was about, did you study separately or specifically these practices of installing visual objects in different spaces in relation to different religious communities? The legalization of the installation of these stages, and also legalization of the dismantling of these stages, because some of the other communities might not be in favor of that. But I will not be able to repeat the justification from the
exactly. I just wanted to know that I get it. No, it was not my object of study. There was a lot of contestation. It was not my object of study. I was less interested in the urban space in the beginning, as in this institutionalization of networks, more ambiguous communities or networks of religious communities around here. So I didn't, I mean, these are, beautiful is a strange word to say in this case, but these are beautiful cases because they kind of give a quick impression of the forces at work in society. Unfortunately, there were not so many cases like that when I was working, except for the one I mentioned, right? These guys, except for the Kievsky and Moskovsky Patriarchate, which I studied in the St. Volodymyr church, which I studied in depth. I have no other case that I followed like that. And maybe St. Michael, like Svetli Mikhail.
Дякуємо щиро, Влад Наумесcu.